Welcome YouTube to another D&D Fridays. Um, it, it is definitely your host, the Geek Life. And today what we're going to be talking about is just how to deal with puzzles, riddles, and traps within a campaign, how to run them, and how to pretty much go through them. But before we do, don't forget, hit that notification bell, that subscribe button, and comment on down below on what interesting traps you might have seen or ran in your campaigns. We'd love to hear more about that. But without further ado, let's get into the topic. So when we think about puzzles, riddles, and traps, the first thing that kind of pops into my head is they're 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 really good at really presenting some sort of obstacle to the players that's not just I fight the dude or whatever. So it offers that new type of thing, that new challenge that you can potentially do and potentially either overcome pretty well or have some dire consequences, depending on what it is about.
Yeah, I really like including or having traps, puzzles, and riddles included because it does more than just exercise one aspect of the game, right? It adds some level of intrigue and makes the players flex their brains a little bit and try and figure out things without just brute forcing their way through everything.
Yeah. The the one thing I'll have to preface that with, though, especially when it comes to puzzles and riddles, though, is as a GM, you have to really keep your eye on the clock, the real time clock, um, especially if you know you have players that might not be super great at puzzles and riddles. Might have to keep track of that, so it doesn't take the next hour or whatever. As one thing that I find that I usually like to do is if I see it start taking more than 5 to 10 minutes, I'll usually say, "All right, guys, somebody make me an intelligence or wisdom check," and that will determine how good of a hint that your characters might have. Maybe you make a pretty good wisdom check, and your character might remember something from like their teacher telling them something like this beforehand, or whatever it may be, and that might crank the gears a little bit in the right direction.
Right? You don't want to make this stuff impossible to beat.
Yeah. And if you're running a game for a bunch of IT folks, just keep in mind they're going to take the most complex solution. So keep that in mind. I've encountered that many, many times.
Huh? Sometimes the most complex solution is, well, I won't finish that because
Well, we'll let everybody else fill in the blank.
yeah,
And no, this is not the SATs or the ACTs.
no standardized tests around here.
But but when it comes to puzzles, puzzles are generally something that the players have to really figure out and on the fly. It usually involves maybe like crossword puzzles or um, something like that the players have to do in a certain order. Maybe they have to like push statues in a certain order or put jewels in a certain order or whatever it may be to like unlock the door into the next room in the dungeon or whatever it may be. Whereas riddles, I feel like riddles are more so you come across a sphinx or a talking door or whatever, and you have to answer a question, and that'll get you access to the dungeon, whatever it may be. So it's kind of like, do you want the players to answer a question, or do you want the players to actually physically do something? I think that's one of the biggest differences, at least for me, between puzzles and riddles.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment wholeheartedly there. I think one is fitting fitting different pieces together. Trying to move stuff around or set things into things like you mentioned, right, in a specific order or whatever. And then the riddle is more using this thing to come up with the right answer moving stuff around.
Yep. And and it's always good to potentially, like, sometimes it might be good to put a in-game timer on that riddle or the puzzle to keep the pressure up. But if you decide to do that, definitely don't do it every single time. Keep it helps keep players on their toes if you do different types of puzzles, different types of riddles, that type of thing. And I think one of the biggest things that I usually like to do is I always like to preface and tell my players beforehand, especially for riddles, but for both as well. Is if one of the players happen to know this riddle or puzzle from doing it before or whatever, I always like to tell them at least play devil's advocate for the first like minute or two to give everybody a chance to attempt to solve the riddle or the puzzle, just to make sure that everybody has that chance of having fun and everything.
Yeah. I think that's one of the challenges is making sure that when a riddle is presented or a puzzle is presented before a group of players, they have to put themselves into the mind of their character instead of trying to solve it themselves, especially if they've seen it before, right? Has think of it in terms of, has my character seen this before? If not, don't just blurt out the answer like what you're suggesting, right?
Yep.
Go at least go through the motions and let people ponder it and go over it and work through it a little bit and enjoy that moment.
Yep. As I've heard stories before where somebody might just immediately blurt out the answer to a riddle, and it's like, come on now, dude. I didn't even get a chance to to think or to RP my character out.
Right. Right.
Whereas if he had just say, all right, I'm gonna give my party like 2 3 minutes to really go through it. If we get it in that time, great. If not, all right, great. I'll figure out how my player would come around to this answer and say it so we can keep the session going.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
So it goes back to that old adage of whether you're a player or the DM, sometimes you gotta curb your person knowledge to ensure the fun for the entire table. But I think they're very good to use every now and then in a regular campaign, and probably even a little bit more if you're running some sort of like mystery or intrigue campaign, or like for instance, the one of the most recent source books, the was it the Candlelight Mysteries, or I think the source book is called. Um,
Candlekeep Mysteries, maybe.
I believe that's the case.
We're super professional here.
We just want to have everybody divulge the mystery of this source book for themselves.
It is Candlekeep Mysteries.
But in Candlekeep Mysteries, I can definitely see a lot of puzzles and riddles being fit into any one of those different mini short campaigns within that source book.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I feel like something like a knowledge domain cleric or any of the wizards would be definitely a front runner for leading the party in a puzzle or a riddle. And also I would definitely say keep your audience in mind when you are creating a riddle or a puzzle or something like that. If you're running a game for a bunch of 10-year-olds, for example, don't bring into the table a puzzle or something that you might need to do some sort of advanced math like calculus. That's not going to fly too well.
Keep it appropriate for your group. That, yes, I think that is a great piece of advice.
Yep. Um, and then moving on to the third part of this, traps. Traps are also a pretty good thing to run in a game, not only just from the regular dungeon delving type of traps, but a trap could also be something to encourage players to get something correct. Maybe they answered the riddle incorrectly, and that sets off a easy trap, or like 1d6 damage or whatever it may be. So traps definitely have a lot of different usages, and but I would say definitely be careful on how you word it, because traps have one of the most popular ways of going about traps, which makes a lot of sense. Pretty much is, how do you detect a trap? Perception. How well do you perceive your surroundings? So that's typically, depending on how the situation is, that could be either passive perception, active perception, or maybe even a active investigation check, depending on how your players are going about a room. So definitely those druids, clerics, rogues, stuff like that with high investigation and perception scores are going to be really excelling at spotting those traps. And traps can take a variety of forms, from your pressure plates to your saw blades in the wall to poison traps, flamethrowers above a door. One of my favorite ways of gaining inspiration for traps and stuff are the first two Home Alone movies, which I love to watch during during the holidays, and just seeing all those traps that are laid out for those criminals in each of the houses. So I think that's a great way to get inspiration for traps if you have some sort of writer's block. And typically from traps, to avoid the damage, it's probably going to be either a dex save or a con save more than likely, but it could be something else. Like if you're in a mind flare colony, there might be some sort of intelligence saving throw trap versus some psychic damage or levitation or whatever. As a GM, I always say, feel free to innovate with traps.
Yep.
And when it comes to also getting a little bit more knowledge and inspiration and stuff, the DMG has a few notes on traps starting on page 120. So definitely check that out as well. And also, Xanathar's Guide to Everything also has some traps starting on page 113. So definitely take a look in those two locations. They'll definitely give you a couple of different types of example traps, from both the easy all the way up to the deadly sort of thing. So depending on how you're trying to challenge your players, those are some great places to really look.
Yeah, these are great examples because, like you said, it ranges from very simple all the way to the very complex, and it doesn't just necessarily focus in on the most obvious place to put a trap, a treasure chest, right? It does different. Excuse me. It gives you ideas of where else to set traps, right? Because obviously the easiest place is that treasure chest, right? But if you want to make the dungeon that you're in, or the settings that you're in, a little bit more dynamic, you can put traps in multiple different locations, right? So
And one of my favorite types of traps that I love to do is, there's a third level spell that a few different spellcasters get, such as clerics. That's called Glyph of Warden. That's a very good trap to potentially put. You basically cast a spell on something, like a ground tile or whatever, and you can basically store either a damage trap or a spelled trap on it. So that can be very useful. Like you about to have your players go up against Archmage in his lair. There could be a couple of glyphs of warden across the ground where somebody steps on it. Now they have to make a wisdom saving throw against a hold person spell or whatever it may be, and that can quite a bit turn the tide and back into the Archmage's favor.
yep,
So there's definitely a lot of different ways to really come up with an innovative type of trap.
absolutely.
And not only for like some sort of like offensive purpose, but also a defensive purpose as well. You have somebody that can cast a Glyph of Warden, and you're about to take a short rest or a long rest in a dungeon or something like that, which I don't usually recommend if you can help it. But put that Glyph of Warden down on a tile, and make sure that people have to come down over that Glyph of Warden if they do come down, and now they have something else to worry about as as a line of defense.
Make them activate your trap cards. So
Exactly.
yeah, I like that you point out that they're both offensive and defensive ways of using traps. Right? It's not just the DM that has the ability to set these up. Right? Obviously, the DM is probably going to be the person that uses them the most because they're the one building the world, leading you through the campaign, etc. But as a player, you still have this ability to do some of this stuff in a defensive manner. I really like that you brought that up.
Yeah, and and I think, especially from a player side of things, really creating traps to help in your situation. I think it really helps to reward the creative player as well.
Again,
Yeah, and also I would say that that when it comes to traps, as a GM perspective, try to vary the traps a little bit. Like if the only thing you do is make a chest be a mimic, players will catch on, and then it becomes no fun. So definitely, so going off of that example with a mimic chest, sometimes make the chest a mimic, sometimes not make it a mimic. Who knows? Or
yep.
or if you do want to trap that treasure chest, maybe go back and put on a glyph of warden on it instead of making it a mimic. So that really helps keep the players thinking and on their toes.
Yeah, really think about why there would be a trap in this location or on this treasure chest, right? Is this in a place that somebody was trying to protect? Is there something really valuable that they're trying to protect? Or is it in just some random location that, in the middle of the forest and it fell off the back of the wagon and it was somebody moving from one little town to the next and you find this treasure chest of stuff? That something that's going to really be trapped, right? So make sure you take into consideration the surroundings around where you're placing this trap and make it fit.
Yeah, and also traps doesn't always have to be on your way to the treasure chest or the final boss room or something. They could be on your way out.
Yep. Yep.
Maybe the archmage doesn't mind people coming to their lair. They just don't want them to leave.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's welcome to my home. You're never leaving again. Hotel California sign up.
And like one of my favorite traps that really goes along that line is players going down a hallway or something to a treasure room. They see like bloody pieces of clothing and blood stains on the walls and stuff like that. So it gets their guard up, but nothing happens. So after a while, they think, "Oh, somebody else must have triggered the trap." Get to the treasure chest or treasure room, get all the treasure and stuff like that. And again, the treasure is what actually sets off the traps and reset everything. So now they have to go back through that funhouse of death. So
The,
just thinking of those different ways of how to go about it.
the classic Indiana Jones treasure trap. Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah, and I like how you brought that up. Like Indiana Jones is another great inspiration for traps as well.
You can get a lot of good ideas from watching some of those shows like that for sure.
Yeah. And when it comes to puzzles as well, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything gave us a lot of good puzzle stuff as well, starting on 171. So that could be some inspiration for maybe something that you might want to throw in as well. And then also, we'll probably do a more in-depth video with this in the future, but I also want to touch base a little bit on environmental hazards as well. They could potentially be used as a trap or something like that as well, depending on how you fit it. It's like if something is taken off of this pressure plate, uh, this giant furnace or wall of fire happens, or somebody has to go stand on this pressure plate to help uh, seal off the room from being flooded by the ocean water above because they're in an underwater temple or something like that.
Sure. Yeah, use the surroundings to your advantage, right?
Yeah,
That, that's the person that put that in place was, you know, uh, creative enough to utilize their surroundings. So be aware of that.
Exactly. And last but not least, just no matter if you're a GM or a player, setting up traps, setting up puzzles, going through the traps, whatever, have fun with it.
Yeah.
And oh, and one more thing when it comes to disarming traps, they can have a multitude of different ways of disarming it. So you don't always have to have a rogue with proficiency in thieves' tools to disarm a trap.
But it definitely makes it easier.
For sure. For sure. And one final thing before I close this out is whenever you're creating a trap or a puzzle or whatnot, especially if you're the DM specifically, um, don't force your players to have to come up with the one solution for it. Have a little bit of flexibility when it comes to that. It's good to have idea of what the answer might be or whatever it may be, but also be willing to accept an answer that might seem logical or reasonable or something like that. For instance, I'll give an example. One of my riddles that I like to throw at new players is pretty much this: I've been burned, beaten, and tortured, and then sent to serve the slaughterer. When am I? My first thought in creating the solution is, okay, that's a sword. That's how a sword is made. They're burned and beaten and everything, and then they're sent to serve a slaughterer, which are soldiers killing other people and whatnot. So that's my first answer. But I'm also willing to accept things like metal and maybe iron or things like that would be very reasonable that somebody could come up with, and that makes a lot of sense. So all in all, the whole point to that is be flexible with your answer.
Yeah, I think if it's not a very super specific sort of puzzle or riddle or thing that you're working on, leaving it open like that makes a lot of sense, right? Giving the players the ability to be close to what the answer is, right? And if you want a very specific answer, you know, make sure that you narrow it down so that people go in that direction, right? Make that riddle or whatever it is, point them in that direction and be more specific in the description.
Yeah. And if the players still can't get it, and you're trying to point them in the right direction, then continue to point them in the right direction with your hints and stuff like that.
Yep.
Yep. Overall, I prefer it's. I think that is better to have leeway on the answer, but if you're going for that super specific answer, make sure that you're on your player's side with making sure that they can get to it reasonably well.
Make sure that you've done your due diligence to make it very specific, that you're looking for a specific answer with the clues and the direction that you're giving them.
Yeah, and make sure that you're given all of the pertinent information that the players will need to solve it. Because if you purposefully hide something from the players, especially if you're expecting a specific answer, the players will never get it unless they're super, super lucky.
Yeah. There's a lot of answers to a lot of questions in this world.
Yeah, so make sure that you provide the needed information, whether it's everything on that piece of paper that the players are reading off of, or if they have to bring like relics to a certain room for the thing, make sure that all the relics are reasonably be able to find stuff like that. But like you said, make sure you have your due diligence, your due care to be on your player side.
Agree?
And all in all, use traps, use puzzles, use riddles. They definitely make things enjoyable.
They spice things up, that's for sure.
Yep. And with that, we'll end off another D&D Fridays. Until next time, folks, keep your lives geeky.
Bye, everybody.